Well, I really like Souls games. I know, you never would have guessed. But today, I decided that instead of looking at Bloodborne or Demon's Souls again, or other Souls games like Elden Ring, I was just going to take a look back at the one that first got me into the series. The first one I ever played, Dark Souls 1, and in particular, I'm going to be taking a look at each area in the game and ranking it from the worst to the best. Now, just a heads up, there will be 3 areas excluded from this list: Firelink Shrine, Ulasil Sanctuary, and the Valley of the Drakes. And in addition to this, I will be combining Darkroot Basin and Darkroot Garden together for this list, as I personally did not feel that there was enough differences between the two to justify them being classified as separate areas. I'll also try to avoid talking about bosses too much, as really, the bosses in this game deserve their own video. However, I will be briefly summarizing my thoughts on each boss in each area, just nothing hugely in depth. So anyway, starting off with what is my least favorite area in the game. So you might be asking yourself, what area was bad enough for you to consider it to be the worst in this game? Well, the area that takes the crown in my book as being the dishonorable 22 spot is none other than the Tomb of the Giants. Now, if the co-op areas in Dark Souls 2's DLC didn't exist, this would probably be the worst area in the series. The level design is pretty much non-existent here, as it's pretty much just one path with a bonfire at a certain point that takes you to the boss. That's all this area consists of, really. But the thing about that path is that it is extremely dark, and finding a light source is your top priority. However, the way to reach the light sources is just not practical. 2 of them are found outside the area, and the other one, the skull lantern that I'm using in the footage, is found a little bit within the area, meaning that you'll either have to let patches kick you down a hole or just fumble around in the dark for ages until you find it. Now, you could go in without a light source at all, but let's be honest, that would be an absolutely awful experience. And once you do get the light source, it's still not that useful because it barely even lights up 2 feet in front of you. So basically either way, you're screwed. But going in with the light source is definitely much better than going in without one. Not to mention the enemy placement as well. It's just not good at all. This is probably some of the most dreadful enemy placement of anywhere in the game. They all just somehow find a way to gang up on you no matter where you are in relation to them. And it just makes it a very awful experience. And any atmosphere that could be created is overshadowed by how overwhelmingly frustrating this area is. Thankfully, the second part of this area is nowhere near as aggravating as the first part, but somehow they managed to make it even more lazily designed. The second part of this area is just a small passageway that takes you over into this room, which has not only a ton of little baby skeletons that just keep respawning, but Pinwheel spammed everywhere. Seriously, of all the boss enemies to turn into regular enemies, why Pinwheel? It's not that I find this part hard, in fact it's pretty easy to run past, but it's just more annoying than anything else. Now, Gravelord Nito is a boss I have very mixed feelings on, and my opinion changes all the time, so I won't really mention my opinion too much on him, but there are 2 things I wanted to mention. One, the very cheap fall damage you take as soon as you enter the arena, which could easily kill you if you're low on health, and 2, the fact that every time you die to him, which I do a good bit because I think he's one of the harder bosses in this game. You have to run all the way back through the Tomb of Giants practically, which gets old very fast. Hey, it's me, Gussie from the future. Turns out I kinda messed up this part because there's a second bonfire in Tomb of the Giants that I did not know about when I recorded that segment. So while the run back to Nito is still bad, it's not as bad as I originally thought it was. Now, this doesn't change my placement of Tomb of the Giants at all, and I still do think it's the worst area in this game by a long shot, but ignore what I said about the run back part because I am an idiot. Anyway, back to the video. On top of that, the Tomb of Giants is just very bland to look at. It's just a very generic cave that happens to be dark. The view of Ash Lake we get is admittedly really cool, but that's not enough to save it from being the worst area in the game in my opinion. So, now that we've got that complete dumpster fire out of the way, let's move on to the second worst area in the game. Our number 21 spot, the Demon Ruins. Now, as soon as you enter the area, you'll notice that you can't really explore much of it, as the vast majority is blocked off by some eye-meltingly ugly-looking lava. The way that you'd get rid of this ugly lava is by going to the side and fighting the first of the area's 3 total bosses, the Ceaseless Discharge. This is definitely one of the worst boss fights in the game, because there's 2 ways to fight it, and neither of them is particularly fun. You can fight him normally, and if you do that, you'll have to deal with some of the game's worst hitboxes, or you could just run all the way back to the fog gate, in which case he'll get stuck on the ledge, and you just hit him a few times, and then he's gone. Once you get past the Ceaseless Discharge, the rest of the area is not much better at all. One thing you'll immediately notice right off the bat is that it has some of the worst enemy placement in the game, even including Tomb of the Giants. Like, just look at these Taurus demons just copy-pasted right next to each other. Why are they just standing around over there? After you walk down a section with equally lazy enemy placement, you go to fight the most unnecessary boss in the game, the Demon Fire Sage. It's okay mechanically, but literally all it is just the Stray Demon, but orange. And the Stray Demon itself was just a reskin of the Asylum Demon, so it's pretty ridiculous at this point. Then, literally right after the Demon Fire Sage, we fight the Centipede Demon, which is an absolutely terrible boss with a bad moveset, horrible visual design, and an even worse arena. And I can't even be relieved once this area is finished, because there's another bad area right after it. And not to spoil anything, but we might be talking about that area very soon. And at number 20, directly after the Demon Ruins, we have Lost Izalith. See? I told you we would be talking about this area shortly. This is by far the most notorious area in the game, and just like the last 2 entries before it, it is a victim of rush development. The first section of this area is a massive swamp of lava. It used to be absolutely hideous to look at, but in the remastered version, it's not nearly as bad. There's a bunch of tiny structures in the lava swamp, but to be honest, none of them are worth visiting, except for this one, which has the only bonfire in the entire area, and even then, it's hidden behind an illusory wall, and since it's the only one of these structures that has an illusory wall to my knowledge, there's a good chance you're likely gonna miss it on your first playthrough. There's only one other feature to this lava swamp part of the area, and that's this is going to sound extremely weird, but there's no other way to put it. there's just a bunch of dragon asses standing in the lava. I'm not kidding when I say that either. They are literally dragon asses. They don't aggro unless you get super close to them, which is a good thing in my opinion, because trying to fight them is just a horrendous and sloppy mess. Once you get past the lava swamp, the rest of Lost Izalith is, well, pretty contentless. It's all pretty much just a long run up to the bed of chaos with a hostile NPC and an invasion from Kirk thrown in. Speaking of the bed of chaos, it really needs no introduction. Everyone hates this boss. It's often considered by most people to be the worst boss in the entire Souls series, and while I personally hate Dragon God from Demon Souls more, I can't deny that this fight is still abysmal, and it's definitely the worst boss in Dark Souls 1, and a very close second to Dragon God. So, now that we've got the worst of the game out of the way, let's move on to better areas, even if only slightly so. And at number 19, we have the Crystal Caves. One theme you might be noticing with a lot of the areas that I don't like is that there's pretty much no level design. And this area kind of epitomizes that, as it's just a walk to Seath the Scaleless. The minimal level design though is far from my biggest complaint with this area, because there's actually a unique gimmick with it that I think could have been executed well, but was badly mishandled. And that is, well, you're supposed to walk across a bunch of invisible pathways in order to get further into the area, and in concept, this gimmick could be done very well. So, we have a solid concept for an area's gimmick, but it was badly mishandled because of just how wonky the gravity in Dark Souls 1 can be. It can make traversing this on your first playthrough really aggravating to deal with, and once you memorize the path to Seath, it's still pretty boring because, well, there's not much to explore in the Crystal Caves. And when it comes to Seath as a boss, yeah, he sucks. But the thing is, his boss runback stands out as being the most obnoxious in Dark Souls 1, and one of the most obnoxious across the Souls series, period. The reason the runback is so obnoxious is because of another one of the biggest problems with the Crystal Caves in general. There is not a single bonfire in the area, meaning that every single time you die to either the area itself or the boss at the end, you have to run all the way back from the previous area and then navigate the invisible floors again and again and again. With all of that having been said, I actually like the visuals of this area. I think it's definitely one of the better looking areas in Dark Souls 1, and along with that, the area is mercifully short. So while I don't particularly enjoy this area, I think it is a lot better than the ones I've listed before it, hence why I gave it the number 19 spot on this list. Coming in at number 18 on the list, we have the Great Hollow. This area honestly just makes me sad. It could have been so good. The level design here and the whole layout of the level itself is honestly not bad by any means. I like the design. I like the layout. It is genuinely interesting. I even like that they hid it behind two illusory walls back in Blighttown. Discovering this area for the first time really is a special feeling that I don't know how to properly describe. So really, this area should be high on the list, but there's one very major flaw with it that pretty much ruins it for me: the busted gravity. The reason the wonky gravity ruins the area for me is because of the nature of its layout. You'll have to be dealing with it even if you know where to go. And at the end, you'll also be very likely to get ganged up on by a bunch of one-shot mushrooms. So yeah, And plus, there's not even a cool boss at the end or anything like that. You just move on to the next area, which is admittedly cool, and spoiler alert, that area is going to appear much later in this list. But overall, I'm just disappointed by this area. But I do consider it to be the best of the bad areas, because admittedly, the level design is pretty cool, and it's not horrible to go through after you know where to go, but still, it's one of the bad areas for me, hence why it got number 18 on the list. Thankfully though, with this area covered, I've covered all of the areas in this game that I dislike. From this point onwards, I'm going to be more positive. I'll start off with the areas that I think are okay, then move on to the goods, the greats, and then the best of this game. At number 17, the first area you will ever encounter in the game, we have the Northern Undead Asylum. This is the area that serves more as the tutorial for the game than anything else, and right off the bat, it teaches you to think differently than most other action RPGs, as when you spawn in, you don't have any of the weapons that your starting class has, and as soon as you open this gate, you'll be met with a giant demon. Now, you can try to fight the demon with just your straight sword hilt, but that's not a good idea. What you're instead meant to do is go through the door at the side of the arena, where not only will you get your weapons, but you'll also go down a path that lets you do a plunging attack on the boss, which if successfully scored, does huge damage. As well as that, there's developer messages at the start of the area, which let you know the controls, which is obviously quite useful for the rest of the game. In terms of bosses, the Asylum Demon is mostly just okay. It does an okay job at the start teaching you to think differently than other action RPGs, but once you actually get to fight it, it's nothing really special, and becomes a complete pushover on subsequent playthroughs. Although I can forgive its easiness, seeing as it is a tutorial boss after all. But one unique thing about this tutorial area is that you can actually come back to it later on in the game, and if you do, you'll unlock a secret boss known as the Stray Demon. It's extremely similar to the Asylum Demon, but it has some new AoE attacks added which might catch you by surprise your first time through. There isn't really a whole lot else to this area, and it may be pretty simple compared to the rest of the areas on this list, but it does a good job as a tutorial area, and even though it's not the greatest in terms of replay value, it is still a massive spike in quality compared to the areas that have come before it, hence why I decided to give it the number 17 spot on the list. Number 16, the Royal Wood. Now, you might be wondering why I decided to put this area above the Northern Undead Asylum, as its level design is even more simplistic, as it's mostly just an open forest space, with a few little sections off to the side, some decent loot, and parts of the abyss poking through. Well, there's a few small reasons why I think it's a bit better than the Undead Asylum. Firstly, the atmosphere of this area is pretty good in my opinion, although I can't properly describe why. Something about this area's atmosphere just clicks with me. Secondly, this area has a much better boss lineup. Kalameet is one of the better dragon fights across the Souls games, and it's a fantastic boss by Dark Souls 1 standards. I actually used to really dislike this guy, then I played the game again and did the DLC, and I've gotta say, he is so much better than I perceived him as before. And that's not even to mention Artorias. I don't even think this guy needs an introduction. He's one of the most beloved bosses in the series, and for pretty good reason. He's my second favorite fight in this game. It is a fantastic fight, and absolutely amazing by Dark Souls 1 standards. So basically, even though the level design is pretty simple even when compared to the Northern Undead Asylum, I think it's better than the Northern Undead Asylum because of the atmosphere and the boss lineup, and that's why I decided to give it the number 16 spot on the list. Number 15, Chasm of the Abyss. Well, speaking of good atmosphere, this area honestly has some of the best in the game in my opinion. The Chasm of the Abyss really is an excellent area in terms of its atmosphere, and the tension it provides on the first playthrough as you stroll down to the boss is unforgettable. Although I will say, gameplay isn't really the highlight of this area for me, as it's mostly just a long stroll to the boss at the end, with a bunch of humanity enemies on the way, which aren't really remarkable to fight. It's a very dark area, but not really in an obnoxious way like Tomb of the Giants, for instance. The darkness is actually balanced out here to where it adds to the atmosphere, but it isn't annoying. And in terms of its boss lineup, well, the area has one boss at its very end, and that is Manus, the Father of the Abyss. And I've gotta say, Manus is easily the best boss in Dark Souls 1 for me, and the only other one that can even compete with him is Artorias. This fight is absolutely amazing. It feels like a very tough challenge, and it's a fight that I always look forward to whenever I do the DLC, and I love everything about it. So while the Chasm of the Abyss itself is nothing special at all in terms of gameplay, the atmosphere of the area and the boss at the end help elevate it a good bit, but still no higher than number 15 on the list. Now moving on to our number 14 spot, we have the Painted World of Ariamis. This area is one of the most hidden in the entire game, and I'll be honest, I struggled a lot finding out where to put it on the list because I have kind of a love-hate relationship with it. One positive thing I have for this area is that I really do like the level design here. I like the little puzzle of trying to figure out how to open the door that takes you to the boss at the end, and I also like the way the area kind of loops back on itself after you go through that one courtyard with a Dark Souls version of the Phalanx from Demon Souls. But the level design isn't 100% perfect either, because there's two ways to reach the switch that opens the door to the boss. The first of which is just a ladder that takes you straight to the room it's at, which I don't really have any problems with, but the second way to reach it is by going through this little underground maze with bone wheel skeletons in the narrow hallways. This little maze section of the level is the bane of my existence. I hate it with an undying passion. Seriously, what the hell were the developers thinking? And not only is this maze section absolutely abysmal to go through, but there's already the before-mentioned ladder that takes you down to the switch, which means the maze section is just completely pointless. And along with this, I'm just not fully big on the enemies that can be found in here, as most of them are just new versions of enemies encountered before, only this time they can inflict toxic on you. With that said though, I think the atmosphere of this area is pretty well executed, and I also like the way the area looks. And along with that, when it comes to bosses, I think that Priscilla is a pretty good concept for a boss, and even though I would have liked it if she had more health, I still think the fight is decent enough, although usually I avoid killing her because it just makes me feel like a bad person, to be honest. So overall, with this area, I decided that the atmosphere, level design, and visuals were strong enough to put it in good tier. However, I do still kind of have a love-hate relationship with it, hence why I put it at the bottom of good tier. And coming in at number 13 on the list, we have Blighttown. Fun fact, I actually used to really hate Blighttown a lot on my first few playthroughs, but I've warmed up to it a lot on more recent playthroughs. When it comes to Blighttown though, the area actually has two sections to it. The first section, no matter what way you enter, is a part where you descend from a bunch of scaffolding. The map layout here is pretty well made, and it always makes for some pretty good exploration, especially since this area has some very good loot for the early game, and every enemy encounter feels tense, but not really unfair. I like this section a lot. It has a pretty good atmosphere as well that feels sort of oppressive, but also mildly terrifying in a way. The only part of the scaffolding bit that I don't like are these damn blow dart enemies. Seriously, these things absolutely suck. So, as you might have noticed, I really do like the first part of this area, but the second part of this area that takes place in the Poison Swamp is just absolute ass! All the Poison Swamp part of the area consists of is just trotting through the water that makes you slower, all while enemies occasionally appear in front of you, and you're also taking damage from poison buildup. And given the fact that the closest bonfire to the boss is about at the midpoint of this swamp, you're gonna have to run through poison every single time you die to the boss. The only good thing I really have to say about this part of the area is that at least it's short. And when it comes to bosses, not only is Quelaag the Chaos Witch of demonetization, but she's also one of the better boss fights in the base game. By the way, while we're on the topic of Quelaag, here's a fun little fact. When I first sat down to edit this segment, I originally had her boss music as the background song, but it really did not fit the gameplay of Blighttown at all, so I ended up changing it to one of the random tracks from the original Demon's Souls, kind of as I did with the Great Hollow. But overall, even if the Poison Swamp part of this area absolutely sucks, it's not enough to ruin the first part of the area for me, and I still really do like Blighttown. And coming in at number 12, we've got the Catacombs. This is the area that comes directly before the Tomb of the Giants, and surprisingly, I think it's actually pretty good. In terms of atmosphere, I think it's on point. I like the way the area feels both oppressive and creepy at the same time, and the darkness in a lot of the rooms actually adds to the atmosphere because it doesn't completely impair your ability to proceed. The central part of this area is one massive cave-like room with a waterfall and a hole in the ceiling that gives light, meaning that the area isn't completely dark, and as well as that, you have a little puzzle of trying to figure out how to switch the bridges over to where you can actually walk across them, which I think was pretty well done. Most of the enemies encountered within the catacombs are skeletons which, unless you have a divine weapon, will keep respawning after you kill them. In order to stop them from respawning, you have to find the nearby necromancer that keeps reviving them, and then kill the necromancer. I think for the most part, this sort of gimmick was well executed, and it doesn't ever really feel annoying to try and find the necromancer. On top of this, the level design is really good as well. A lot of times, the side paths will actually loop back into the main path of the area, and overall, I think the exploration is pretty fun, and I also love the layout of the central cave room. Since I've praised this area so much, you might be wondering why I didn't decide to put it near the top of the list. Well, there's one part of the area that I'm not keen on, the last little bit before the boss. This section is extremely short, but pretty much all it is you just running to the fog gate while a bunch of bone wheel skeletons chase behind you. I already mentioned these bone wheel skeletons before when I talked about the painted world of Ariamis, and I don't think this section is nearly as bad as the maze bit from that area, but it's still not fun here, and you can easily get stun-locked to death by them if you're not careful. And with the boss, I don't really know what to say. Pinwheel is the joke boss of the game. He has the single smallest health bar of any boss, and he goes down in like 3 seconds. I don't even know what to properly think of this fight right now because man, oh man, does he go down quick. I think he could have been decent if he just had more health, but even with that one piece of complete trash, I think this area is very solid, creepy, and atmospheric. I like this one. It's a pretty good area. Moving on to our number 11 spot, we've got the Depths. Now, I've put the Depths above the Catacombs on this list, but I just want to say really quick that I think they're practically interchangeable in terms of quality. Atmospherically, I think this area is honestly pretty great. It managed to perfectly nail the whole murky, damp sewer vibe, and I like it quite a lot. When it comes to this area's level design, it's mostly a pretty linear path. However, it manages to loop back into itself with a shortcut right before the boss, and along with that, you can actually see the boss's arena somewhat early on in this area. Another thing to note about this area for me is just how maze-like everything feels. The area is by no means the largest in the game. However, with the way it's laid out, with a lot of sections with tight, cramped, narrow hallways that are arranged as though they're little mini-mazes, it makes the area feel large and confusing, and that's something that I absolutely love. And when it comes to boss fights, I'd say the Gaping Dragon is definitely one of the most memorable boss encounters in the game. It's got one of the most vicious and awesome looking designs in the series, and even though it's less solid mechanically than some of the other bosses, it's still pretty decent. And fun fact about this guy, one time I was actually helping out one of my close friends in co-op, and we started fighting this boss, and during the fight I managed to glitch the game for the first time. Thankfully, I managed to record a clip of the glitch right as it happened, so here you go. So overall, I'd say that the Depths is a pretty decent area, and even though I know it's 100% optional, I always take the time to come down here and play through it on each new playthrough. Okay, so something about a lot of the Souls games is that the final locations are more just staging areas for the game's final boss. And out of all of those areas, I don't think there's any that do it better than our number 10 spot, the Kiln of the First Flame. In terms of level design, the area is pretty much just a walk to the boss at the end, and it's pretty short, but I don't really think outstanding level design is the point of this area. Instead, the main focus of this area is on the atmosphere and the build-up to the game's final boss. And these two things it did perfectly. This location has been the build-up for most of the game, and since the player will have this goal of reaching the kiln in mind, it makes the build-up to when they finally enter it absolutely phenomenal. However, once you walk down the stairs and enter the area, you find a complete barren wasteland, and then at the end of it all, after walking through the ashen, barren wasteland, you encounter Gwyn, except he's no longer the Lord of Sunlight. Now all he is the Lord of Cinder, nothing more than an empty husk of what he once was. And on the way to reach the boss, you'll also encounter the Black Knights, elite members of Gwyn's army, who not only aided him in the wars against the Witch of Izalith and the Chaos Demons, but also followed him into the Kiln of the First Flame back when he linked the fire. But now, all they exist as is just stray spirits who still wander Lordran. I guess what I'm trying to say here with this is that the beautiful scenery of the area, the build-up to it, the atmosphere of the area itself, and the boss at the end are all the perfect way to close out this game, even despite the minimal level design. Moving on to our number 9 spot, we have the Undead Parish. I'll be honest, I kind of debated whether or not I should consider this area as a part of the Undead Burg, since it looks very similar and it's directly connected to it, and this area isn't very long, but I ultimately decided to count it as a separate area. When it comes to the level design, I do think that there are areas that do it better, but the Undead Parish is still pretty good in this aspect, with my absolute favorite example of its level design being the elevator that takes you back down to Firelink Shrine. Traveling what felt like absolute miles only to discover that I was right above where I'd started from really was a mind-blowing moment on my first playthrough, and it's a perfect example of what made Dark Souls 1's world design so special. Aside from its great level design, this area is the first in the game to be very important, as it's where you'll ring the first Bell of Awakening, and after you go through the main church, you'll enter a boss fight against the Bell Gargoyles, which I personally think is a pretty great boss, and it's the first in the game that really shines when it comes to gameplay. My only real complaint with this area is just that I wish we got more of it, because, again, it's really short. But when we've got one of the best instances of Dark Souls 1's interconnected world design, a pretty great boss at the end, and everyone's favorite blacksmith, Andre, it's hard for me to really hate the area at all, and in fact, I think it's pretty great. And that's why I gave it number 9 on the list. Moving on to number 8, we've got the Darkroot Garden. Now, one thing about this area is that this is actually the present-day version of an area that appeared much earlier on, the Royal Wood. And I've gotta say, I think this area is definitely a lot better than the Royal Wood was. Atmospherically, this area is similar to the Royal Wood, but it's darker, and it's also shrouded in a purple fog that makes the area look like it's always nighttime. The first boss you'll be encountering in this area is the Moonlight Butterfly, and admittedly, it's a pretty dull boss fight. Although I will say, I do really like the section before the Moonlight Butterfly. It's pretty short, but pretty sweet. There's actually a side path you can take which seemingly branches off from the rest of the area, only for it to tie right back into the main path via a ledge you can jump across. And I'll be honest, I think this is a really good instance of level design. There's also the Darkroot Basin section, which is mostly just a bunch of crystal golems along with a giant hydra in the lake at the center, which, although pretty janky to try and fight, looks really awesome. The rest of the area is pretty much just an open forest space with a bunch of NPCs who honestly aren't bad to fight by any means. Mostly this part of the area just builds you up to Sif, which is an absolutely excellent boss in my opinion. Now this area probably sounds good, but not really great, and honestly, I can't really blame people for thinking that. The hardest thing about this area to describe for me is just what makes me like it so much. I don't know why, but something about this area just does it for me. Hence why I decided to put it at number 8 on the list. And at number 7, we have Ash Lake. Earlier on, when I was talking about the Great Hollow, I said that this area would be appearing much later in the list. And hey, here it is. I think Ash Lake is pretty damn cool. When it comes to the level design, I will admit that it's not really this area's strong point, as aside from one little tree area with 2 basilisks and a one-shot mushroom, and thankfully without any awful gravity, it's mostly just a linear path to the end. However, I can forgive the lack of level design, seeing as it's not really meant to be a massive interconnected level, and instead more of a cool secret for making it to the end of the Great Hollow. And after reaching the end of the level where you're chased by a giant Hydra down the linear path, you find the Path of the Dragon Covenant, led by the final Everlasting Dragon, which is not only a cool bonus for finding this area, but also an amazing moment on the first playthrough. So I guess the reason I enjoy the area so much is because of the visuals, the lore behind it, the Everlasting Dragon at the end, along with the amazing music that plays whenever you enter it, which you're definitely hearing in your head right now, and not just because I put it as background music. And at number 6, we have the Undead Burg. Now let's start off with the absolute best thing about this area in my opinion, the level design. This area I think has some of the best level design in the game, and it's the area that caused me to fall in love with the way Dark Souls' world is built. There's a very clear main path that you're supposed to follow with this area, however, it's not the only bit of content, as there's also a ton of little bits where you can access some optional segments of the area, which end up making it feel much larger than it actually is. The enemy placement as well is absolutely great here. It feels very deliberate and thought out, meaning that sometimes enemy encounters can feel a little bit challenging for the early game, but not unfair. And for the first of the area's 2 bosses, I think that the Taurus Demon is a pretty decent fight, although I will say the setup to it is a little bit odd for being so early in the game. He's also very weak to gold pine resin, and the reason I bring this up is because the area actually hints this to you by hiding 3 gold pine resins in a chest right before the boss. This part of the area is absolutely superb, and I love it a lot. But then there's also the bad part of this area, which is the only reason why this area wasn't in the top 5 spots, and that is the Lower Undead Burg. The Lower Undead Burg has absolutely none of the positive qualities that I just listed about the Upper Undead Burg. It has practically no interesting level design whatsoever, the enemy placement is pretty dodgy, and those enemies with the dodgy placement are dogs and hollow thieves, which are pretty terrible to try and fight. So anyway, once you make it past that awful thing, the boss isn't any good either. The Capra Demon absolutely sucks. The arena is terrible. There are 2 dogs with him in the arena that try to bum rush you at the same time. I hate this boss fight. But now that we've washed our hands clean of the filth that was the Lower Undead Burg, I've gotta say, the Upper Undead Burg is what makes me love this area so much. And although the Lower Undead Burg knocks the area out of the top 5 in this game for me, it's still really close, and you can probably tell since I put it at number 6. Coming in at number 5, we've got Sen's Fortress. Now, this area is only accessed after you've rung both Bells of Awakening, but I've gotta say, it definitely did not disappoint by any means. Almost right after you enter the area, you'll be taught to be careful, as not only are there a bunch of swinging pendulum anchor things, but there's also some mages above the area shooting lightning down at you, making sure that you're patient and watch your step. Another thing about this area that I think is worth going over is that it is absolutely loaded with traps. You've got your fair share of arrows firing out of the wall after you step on a pressure plate, and things like that, but then you've also got things like the giant boulder that you can actually change the direction of, which I think is pretty cool. And as for the outside bits, there's a bunch of giants which will often throw explosive boulders at you. However, if you manage to reach them, you can actually kill them, and you'll be able to explore the area without interruption. And a brief comment about the outside areas, but man, that view you get of the world down below you is absolutely gorgeous. And I love that you're able to see Anor Londo above you as well. And in addition, I think that the map layout of both the indoor and outdoor parts of this area is really good. It makes the area feel almost like some sort of Zelda dungeon in a way, and I've gotta say, I'm a pretty big fan of it. But aside from the main path of this area, the only side bit that stuck out to me was this one place where you meet the NPC with Ricard's Rapier, one of the more iconic dex weapons across the trilogy. And man, this dude is an absolute parry god, so be a little bit careful. Or maybe I just suck at the game, I don't know. And as for the boss, I'd say the Iron Golem is decent. I mean, I don't find the fight to be particularly amazing or anything, but it's an okay boss and it gets the job done. So overall, this area's got some good level design, a great map layout, enemies in different and fun scenarios, and a pretty decent boss fight at the end. Seems worthy of number 5 to me. Number 4, the Duke's Archives. Out of all the areas on this list, this one has by far the biggest deviation from the typical format. Upon entering the area, you'll fight against a Chandler and a bunch of crystallized hollows before ascending an elevator that takes you into this little stairway with an NPC that leads you to a boss fight. However, before you end up getting disappointed, there's a catch. This boss fight against Seath is the only one in the game that's impossible to win. It's a supposed to lose room, and once you die to him, you don't respawn at the previous bonfire you rested at, and instead, you'll respawn at a new bonfire in a jail cell. I love the changes this area made to the typical format. The moment where you wake up in the jail cell is something that completely caught me off guard on my first playthrough, and it was genuinely scary. But luckily for me, the snakes are the absolute worst prison guards of all time, and then you proceed to make the most terrifying jailbreak ever. After making the jailbreak straight from hell, you access the rest of the Duke's Archives, which is mostly a puzzle of figuring out how to rotate these stairs correctly so you can exit the area. And honestly, I love this puzzle. I think it was very well executed, it was creative, and it's even fun on returning playthroughs when you already know the solution. And in addition to this, I think the way this area looks is really good. It gives an almost Hogwarts type atmosphere, but corrupted by Dark Souls' influence. And in addition to this, I also love the outside bits where you can see just how much higher up you are than the rest of Lordran. But then again, with that said, there's also this forest at the end, which just... ew. One other thing I appreciate about this area is its pretty solid level design. There's a pretty cool shortcut before the ugly forest I just showed, and in addition to this, the whole puzzle of flipping the stairs around allows for a genuinely interesting layout for this area. In short, this area has pretty good level design, a nice puzzle of flipping the stairs around, A creative change to the format with the unwinnable fight, and overall, this area is extremely well designed in my opinion, earning it the number 4 spot. But with all that said, there's now only 3 areas left to go. These 3 areas share the same tier for being the best in the game in my opinion. One thing to keep in mind, these 3 areas' order that they're listed in is not constant. As if I'm being honest, my favorite of these 3 depends on what day you ask me. So for this list, I decided to list them all based on my own personal preference at this exact moment while making this, but pretty much all 3 of them are interchangeable. So anyway, let's finally move on to what we've been working towards this whole time, the absolute best that this game has to offer. Number 3 on our list goes to Oolacile Township. One thing about the DLC I want you to keep in mind is that this is the first time in a long while where I've 100% completed the DLC, and man, when I went in, I didn't think that any of its areas would place this high on the list, but I absolutely adore Oolacile Township. This is the exact city that first awoke Manus, and by the time you arrive, it's already being swallowed up by the Abyss, and the map design reflects this. You start off at the top in the last little bit of the city that hasn't yet been swallowed by the Abyss, and you gradually work your way down, eventually entering the Chasm of the Abyss itself. All the while you can hear the screams of Oolacile residents in the distance. Briefly, I want to address this area's atmosphere. It's perfect, it feels exactly like what the devs were shooting for with it, and I absolutely love it. The way the area looks on the outside is absolutely beautiful with all of the views you get of it, and the screams in the distance add an extra layer of atmosphere to this area. When it comes to this area's map layout as well, I think it is absolutely excellent. It manages to perfectly balance out feeling like a fantasy setting, feeling like an actual feasible human settlement, and feeling like something in a video game. Not only is the map layout and the atmosphere of this area on point though, because the level design here is pretty good too. The whole area is laid out very vertically, and there's not really much to it horizontally, but it manages to feel pretty big in my opinion, and there's a bunch of cool little secrets on the side if you decide to try and search for them with OCD levels of exploration like me. There's also this wicked cool shortcut towards the end of the area with this elevator that takes you right back to the start, which is pretty cool and was very unexpected even after I'd seen all the shortcuts of the areas in the base game. So as you can tell, I think this area here is pretty amazing. If I had to pick anything to really nitpick about, it would be that I wish there was a little more content even if it was kinda more on the side and optional, and I wish there was a little bit more enemy variety. Don't get me wrong, I don't really mind the enemies that are in this area, but I wish we got more variety with them because there's only 3. There's the corrupted Oolacile residents, there's the Oolacile sorcerers, and whatever the hell this thing is. Those 3 are the only enemies that are exclusive to this area, and besides them, the only one you'll be encountering from the start of the area to the end of it is this one mimic that exists, I guess. But these 2 complaints are really just very small personal nitpicks, and I don't really count it against this area too much. So overall, I consider it to be among the best in the game, and so I put it at number 3. Okay, if this were any other area on the list, I would have given it a proper introduction. But I think this cutscene speaks for itself. Yeah, I don't think there's anything I could possibly say that would even come close to topping that introduction. You might be surprised to see that I put Anor Londo at the number 2 spot, but remember what I said. The top 3 areas on this list are really just the 3 areas that share the number 1 spot in the game for me, so they're pretty much interchangeable, and Anor Londo is by far among the best, and it's the most iconic area in this game for a good reason. First things first, this area is just breathtaking. It is easily the prettiest area in the game. It manages to blow all the other areas out of the water in terms of visuals, even Oolacile Township, which I was just praising like a minute ago. The first bit of this area is where you take the elevator down and then reach this one part where it's seemingly impossible to progress any further. However, if you do a little bit of exploration, you'll find that you can enter through a broken window into this one other section with a bunch of painting guardians on some rafters where you have to be careful. If I'm being 100% honest, I really don't like this rafters section, especially since this game has very bad gravity physics, and the pathways here are extremely narrow. But after you finish the rafters section, you get to experience a moment of great level design with these rotating stairs, which seem to have inspired the ones in the Duke's archives. Only this time, the rotating stairs only serve as a shortcut and a way to access the first of this area's 2 bosses, this one being optional. And yeah, okay, Gwendolyn does kind of suck, but he's at least a nice addition for the lore in my opinion. Once the rotating stairs are activated though, you gain access to the final part of Anor Londo before you enter the main cathedral itself, the infamous Archer section, which, if I'm being honest, I don't think I've ever really had that much trouble with it, so I have no strong feelings. After the little Archer bit though, you enter the main cathedral, and things only get better from here. The whole layout of the inside of the main cathedral is mostly centered around 2 spiral stairways with a bunch of areas around them which help you progress further. These rooms though, don't just have what you need to progress, because they can also have some pretty nice secrets, with the absolute best of them for me being the room that has all of Havel's armor. It's pretty well hidden, and it's really awesome to discover for the first time. The only enemies you'll really be encountering during this part of the Grand Cathedral are the Silver Knights, but to be honest, I don't 100% mind this because I think they're really fun to fight in all honesty. At the very end of the area, you enter the main room of the main cathedral, which has some giant sentinels as well as a shortcut to the boss. Speaking of the giant sentinels, the most I've ever gotten owned in any of the 3 Dark Souls games is due largely to them. I'd try explaining what happened here, but there's nothing I can say that'll replicate what this clip is like. Just look at it. Well, now that I've humiliated myself beyond all possibility, it's time to talk about the boss. To summarize my thoughts, I love Ornstein Smough. It's a fantastically designed multi-boss fight, and I think it's the perfect boss to cap off the first half of the game. So overall, with Anor Londo, My only real complaint besides the rafter section is just that I honestly wish we got more of it. However, again, just like my criticisms with Oolacile, this is a minor gripe I have with this area, and the rest of it is absolutely excellent, and well worthy of being in the best of the game tier. However, before we move on to our number 1 spot, I just want to say ahead of time, YouTube commenters like this guy I'm displaying on my screen, please get your pitchforks ready, because this one's actually a pretty big hot take. But with all of that aside, the area that takes the long anticipated crown of being the number 1 best area in the game in my opinion is none other than the New Londo Ruins. Firstly, let's start out with this area's atmosphere. Just like Oolacile, the atmosphere here is absolutely perfect, and similar to Oolacile, it's a city that's being affected by the Abyss, but whereas Oolacile was being swallowed up by the Abyss, the New Londo Ruins managed to dodge being completely swallowed up, but at the cost of the area being flooded and all of its residents killed. Nowadays, the New Londo Ruins is only inhabited by ghosts, dark wraiths, and corrupted beings of the Abyss. This area manages to be one of the very few across the series that manages to be genuinely scary without relying on a cheap, frustrating gimmick or anything of the like. It manages to be very fun to play in as well as tense and creepy. The closest thing to a gimmick this area has is the way the ghosts work. You see, you won't be able to damage them, but they'll be fully able to damage you unless you have a transient curse. And if you use a transient curse for a temporary amount of time, you'll be able to inflict damage on the ghosts and kill them. Thankfully, right at the start, the area gives you 2 transient curses, and it's a pretty constant drop from the ghosts as well, so the chances of running out of transient curses is pretty low. In the first half of this area, you wander the upper section of New Londo, and the goal is to find the Sealer so he can give you the keys to the floodgates, so that way you can drain the water in this area and access the lower half. The level design with the first half of this area may not be super complex, but I think it's very solid. It actually feels like some sort of ancient, long abandoned and forgotten city. And in addition to this, I think the whole concept of removing the floodwater was done very well. It's a unique thing this area has, and I gotta say, I'm a pretty big fan. As for the second half, it doesn't really have as linear of a path to go down, and it doesn't really have as much complicated level design as the first half did, but the atmosphere is even stronger here. There's some pretty nicely designed shortcuts to the top half again, and the Dark Wraiths are pretty fun to fight for me. As for the boss at the end, I've seen some people have mixed feelings about the Four Kings, and well, I don't know what to tell you. I really like this one. This boss, in my opinion, is a pretty fun and tense challenge to try and burn each king down. It doesn't ever really feel unfair, and overall, I honestly think this is one of my favorite fights in the game. My only real complaint with this area is the lack of bonfires, but since the previous area, Firelink Shrine, is pretty close, I mean, I don't know what to say again. I didn't have as much of an issue as a lot of other people did. So overall, for all the reasons I've listed in this segment, I consider New Londo Ruins to be the best that Dark Souls 1 has to offer. Well, it's finally here. To my subscribers, I know you waited a long time for this video, and I'm really sorry that it took this long to finish it. And to everyone who made it this far, whether subscriber or not, I just want to say, thank you for watching. Seriously, it really does mean a good bit. The next video will probably be something similar to this, but for Dark Souls 2, And until that comes out, I'll see you guys later.